The last thing my wife ever said to me was that I needed to eat more vegetables. I told her I would. I lied, and she knew I was lying, and she laughed anyway. That was a Tuesday. By Friday she was gone. A blood clot, the doctor said. Like that was supposed to explain something. Like 2 words were enough to describe a 38-year marriage disappearing on a Friday afternoon while I was in the waiting room drinking terrible coffee from a paper cup. Her name was Margaret. Everybody called her Maggie. I called her Maggie for 38 years, and then I stopped having anyone to call that, and the silence in our house on Clover Street became something I had to learn to live inside of. The way you learn to live inside a coat that doesn't quite fit. I am 63 years old. I spent 30 years as a firefighter in Roanoke, Virginia. I have pulled people from burning buildings. I have carried children down ladders in the middle of the night. I thought I was a man who could handle hard things. I was not prepared for my own daughter. Her name is Claire. She is 34 years old, and she has her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh, and almost nothing else of Maggie in her, though I didn't understand that until much later. She called me the week after the funeral, which was thoughtful, and she called me the week after that, and after that, she asked how I was eating. She asked if I was sleeping. She said she was worried about me alone in that big house. I told her I was fine. She said dads always say that. I said she wasn't wrong. Her husband's name is Derek. I will tell you what I know about Derek. He shakes hands too firmly, the way men do when they want you to notice how firm their handshake is. He laughs at his own jokes before he finishes telling them. He calls me by my first name, which is Harold. And something about the way he says it has always felt slightly wrong to me, slightly off-center, like a picture hung almost level on a wall. They moved in with me 4 months after Maggie died. It was Claire's idea. She said she couldn't sleep knowing I was alone in that house. She said it was temporary, just until I got my footing back. I said I didn't need help getting my footing. She said, "Dad, please?" And I said yes because she said please and because she had her mother's eyes. The house on Clover Street had 4 bedrooms. Maggie and I had talked about selling it once the kids were grown, getting something smaller, easier to maintain. We never did. Now Claire and Derek took the bedroom at the end of the hall, the one with the window that looks out over the backyard where I used to keep a garden, and I kept the master bedroom with the closet that still smelled like Maggie's perfume, and I told myself this was going to be fine. For a while, it was almost fine. Claire cooked dinner most nights. She rearranged the kitchen in a way I didn't love but didn't complain about. Derek mowed the lawn without being asked, which I appreciated. We watched television together on Sunday evenings. It felt, on the surface, like a family. The first thing I noticed was small. I was looking for the folder where I kept my utility bills, the physical copies, the ones I'd been filing in the same green folder in the same kitchen drawer for 20 years. The folder was gone. Claire said she'd moved everything to an online system, that it was easier, that she'd set up an account for me. I said I preferred the folder. She said, "Dad, it's the 21st century." I let it go. The second thing was less small. I went to the ATM to get cash for the hardware store, the way I always did, every other Thursday, $100 for odds and ends. The machine said my available balance was lower than it should have been, significantly lower. I went inside and asked the teller, a young woman I didn't recognize, and she looked at her screen for a moment and then told me there had been several transfers in the past 6 weeks. To a joint account, she said. I told her I didn't have a joint account. She looked at her screen again. She said it was listed as a household management account, added about 2 months ago with a co-signer. The co-signer's name was Derek. I went home and asked Claire about it. She sat me down at the kitchen table like I was a child who'd come home with a bad report card. She said Derek and I had talked about this. Didn't I remember? She said I'd been so scattered since Mom died that it made sense to have someone helping manage things. She said Derek was good with money. She said this with a straight face. I said I didn't remember agreeing to that. I said I would have remembered. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, "Dad, you're still grieving. You're not yourself. We're just trying to help." And something in the way she said it made me feel, for just a moment, like maybe she was right. Like maybe I was confused. Like maybe the grief had done something to my memory that I wasn't aware of. I went to bed that night feeling smaller than I had since I was a boy. But I am a man who spent 30 years walking into fires, And there is something that happens in your body when you've done that long enough. A kind of alarm, not loud, not panicked, just a low, steady signal that says something is wrong. I felt it that night, lying in the dark, listening to the house. And I made a decision. I did not say anything more to Claire. I did not confront Derek. I started paying attention. What I noticed over the next 6 weeks, Derek made 2 phone calls in the backyard, both times walking to the far corner near the fence, both times looking back toward the house. Claire started bringing up the subject of assisted living in a casual way, mentioning a friend's father who had moved into a place in the valley and was very happy there. She mentioned it twice, then 3 times. Derek started asking me about my retirement pension, whether the monthly amount would change, who handled it if I became incapacitated. He said it conversationally, over dinner, like it was a natural thing to be curious about. And then Claire left a document on the printer. I don't think she meant to leave it. Or maybe she did. I have turned that question over many times since then, and I still don't know the answer. It was a draft of a power of attorney document. My name was on it, and Derek's name was on it, and there were lines for signatures, and the date at the top was 2 weeks away. I stood in the hallway outside the home office for a long time holding that piece of paper. I put it back exactly where I found it, and I went to bed, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, and I thought about Maggie. I thought about how she used to say that Derek was slippery. I had told her she was being unfair. She had given me the look she gave me when she was right, and I hadn't caught up yet. She was right. She was always right. I'm sorry, Maggie. The next morning I drove to Kowalski's Hardware on Jefferson Street. I have been going to Kowalski's Hardware since 1987. It is not the cheapest hardware store in Roanoke. It is not the most convenient. But it is owned by a man named Joe Kowalski, and Joe has been cutting the ribbon at the same cash register for 36 years, and he knows everybody in town, and more importantly, he has known me since before Claire was born. He came to Maggie's funeral. He brought a casserole. He didn't say much at the service, just shook my hand and held it for a moment, the way men of a certain generation do when words are not enough. I walked into the store that morning, and Joe looked up from the register and said, "Harold, you look terrible." I said I'd been having trouble sleeping. He said, "Sit down." He pulled out the stool he keeps behind the counter and pushed it toward me. I sat down, and I told him what I'd found on the printer. I told him about the bank account. I told him about the questions Derek had been asking. I told him about the assisted living references. Joe listened without interrupting, which is rare. He has a face that doesn't move much when he's thinking, like a man playing cards. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Harold, do you know a real estate attorney named Patterson? Works out of an office on Colonial Avenue?" I said I didn't. Joe said Derek had been in the store 3 weeks ago. Said Derek didn't know Joe knew me. Said Derek had been talking on the phone while he was browsing the plumbing aisle. Not quietly, the way people do when they think a hardware store is empty. Joe said Derek had said a name, Patterson. He'd said something about a timeline and something about the house and something about getting the signature before the old man starts asking questions. The old man. I sat on that stool and I felt something move through me that I don't have a better word for than cold. Not anger. Not yet. Just cold. The kind of cold that comes when you understand something fully, all at once, with no room left for maybe. Joe watched my face. He said, "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you." I said I was glad he did. He said he was sorry. I said, "Don't be sorry. Just help me think." We talked for 2 hours. Joe closed the store at noon, something he never does, and we sat in the back room where he keeps the overstock, and we drank coffee and we made a plan. The plan was simple. I would not sign anything. I would not let them know I knew. I would call my own attorney, a man named Gerald Ashworth who had handled mine and Maggie's estate planning, and I would get ahead of this before the date on that document arrived. What I did not plan for was what happened that Thursday. I had an appointment with Gerald Ashworth at 2 in the afternoon. I had told Claire I was going to get a haircut and run some errands. I had told her I would be back by 4. She had smiled and said, "Of course, Dad, drive safe." And I had looked at that smile and I had thought about every dinner she'd cooked, every phone call after the funeral, every time she'd said I was scattered and not myself. And I had understood, finally and completely, that I had been managed, that the kindness had a purpose. I drove to Jefferson Street first because I needed a moment that felt normal, and Kowalski's hardware at 10 in the morning felt normal. Joe was behind the register. He looked at me when I came in. He said, "You okay?" I said I was on my way to Gerald's office. He said, "Good." I was in the store maybe 20 minutes, just looking at things, touching the handles of tools I didn't need, the way you do when you need your hands to have something to do. I bought a package of wood screws I didn't need. I was heading for the door when Joe said, "Harold." Wait. His voice was different, not loud, not alarmed, but different enough that I stopped. He said, "Come back here for a second." I went back to the counter. He had his phone in his hand. He said, "I just got a call from my cousin Patty. She works at that law office on Colonial, Patterson's office." I said, "Okay." He said, "Patty called me because she recognized your name on a file. She said there's a meeting scheduled for this afternoon, not 2 o'clock, 11:30, at the office." I looked at him. I said, "That's right now." He said, "Patty says Derek is already there. He's been there since 11, and Harold," he paused, "Claire is with him." I had driven myself to that store. I had my keys in my hand. My car was right outside. I could have walked out the door and driven to Colonial Avenue and walked into that office, and I don't know exactly what I would have done, but I know it would not have been useful. Joe came around the counter. He was 68 years old and moved slowly because of his knee, but he moved fast enough that morning. He put his hand on my arm. He said, "Sit down." I said I needed to go. He said, "I know, but not yet. Just sit down for 1 minute and let me call Gerald first." I sat down on the stool. I sat there and I breathed and I listened to Joe call Gerald Ashworth and explain the situation in the clipped, efficient way of a man who has run a business for 36 years. Gerald picked up on the second ring. Joe handed me the phone. Gerald said, "Harold, listen to me. If you walk into that office right now, they will tell the judge you were agitated and erratic. They will use it." He said, "Here is what you need to do instead." Gerald told me to go home. He said to say nothing, act normal, make dinner if I felt like it. He said he was filing an emergency injunction that afternoon to freeze any transfer of power or real estate until a competency evaluation could be arranged, not because there was any question about my competency. He was very clear about that. But because it would stop the clock, he said, by tomorrow morning, they cannot move forward with anything. I gave the phone back to Joe. Joe listened for another moment, said thank you, hung up. He looked at me. He said, "Go home, Harold." I said, "She's my daughter." He said, "I know." I said, "She has her mother's eyes." He said, "I know that too." He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, "Go home, come back tomorrow." I drove home. I do not remember the drive clearly. I remember turning onto Clover Street and sitting in the driveway for a long time, looking at the house. The house where I had brought Maggie home from our honeymoon. The house where Claire had taken her first steps in the hallway outside the kitchen. The house where I had sat by Maggie's side of the bed every night for 6 months after she got sick, just sitting there, just being close. I went inside. I made a sandwich. I ate it standing at the kitchen counter. I washed the plate. I went and sat in my armchair, and I waited. Claire and Derek came home at 4:30. Claire was bright and smiling in a way that meant she was performing. She said, "How were your errands?" I said, "Fine." She said, "Anything exciting?" I said, "Just the hardware store." Derek asked what I'd gotten, and I said wood screws, and he nodded like that was perfectly reasonable, and I watched him and thought, "You are in my house, and you are eating my food, and you are planning to have me declared incompetent, so you can sell this house and put me somewhere quiet, where I can't cause trouble?" And I sat with all of that, and I said nothing. Gerald called at 9 that night. He said the injunction was filed. He said, "Whoever drafted that power of attorney is going to have a very unpleasant morning tomorrow." He said, "Harold, I want you to document everything you remember. Write it down tonight. Times, dates, conversations, all of it." I wrote for 3 hours. I filled 11 pages. The next morning I was up at 5:30. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with my 11 pages and a second cup of coffee, and I waited. Derek came downstairs at 7. He was in his gym clothes, the way he always was on weekday mornings. He looked at me sitting there, and something crossed his face. Very quick, like a shadow. He said, "Morning, Harold." I said, "Good morning." He went to make coffee. He stood at the coffee maker with his back to me, and I could see, from the set of his shoulders, that something was wrong with him. He knew. Claire came down at 7:30. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me, and I looked at her, and for a moment we were just two people looking at each other. She said, "Dad." I said, "Claire." She said, "We need to talk." I said, "Yes, we do." We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us. Derek had his coffee cup in both hands. Claire had her hands flat on the table. I had my 11 pages face down in front of me. I said, "I know about Patterson. I know about the account Derek opened without my knowledge. I know about the power of attorney. I know about the timeline, and my attorney knows all of it too." Claire's face did something complicated. For a moment I thought I saw something real in it, something like the girl who used to come downstairs on Christmas morning and shake me awake before it was light outside. Then the moment passed. She said, "Dad, you don't understand the full situation." I said, "Then explain it to me." She said, "You are not doing well. You haven't been doing well since Mom died. You forget things. You lose track of time. We were trying to protect you." I said, "From what, Claire?" She said, "From yourself." I looked at her. I looked at Derek. Derek was looking at the table. I said, "Your mother knew. She told me years ago that something was off. I told her she was being unfair. I owe her an apology that I can't give her now." Claire said, "You're upset. You're not thinking clearly." I put my hands on the table. I said, "I am thinking more clearly than I have in 2 years." I said, "I want you both out of this house by the end of the week." Derek started to say something. I looked at him. He stopped. Claire said, "Dad, please." I said, "Please doesn't work anymore, sweetheart." That's how this started. She looked at me for a long time. Then she stood up. She said, "You're going to regret this." I said, "I already regret a lot of things. That's not a reason to keep making the same mistake." They were gone by Thursday. I stood in the empty room at the end of the hall the Friday after they left, the one with the window that looks out over the backyard, and I stood there for a while. The room smelled like Derek's cologne. I opened the window. Gerald handled the financial side. It took about 3 months to fully untangle what Derek had done with the joint account, the redirected deposits, the preliminary conversations with a real estate broker that we found in his email. It was not as bad as it could have been, though that is a low bar. Gerald said Derek had been careful, which is lawyer language, for this was intentional and planned. I knew that already. Claire called twice in the first month. I did not answer. She sent a letter in the second month that I read once and then put in a drawer. In the letter she said Derek had taken advantage of her grief too, that she hadn't understood what he was doing, that she'd trusted him the same as I'd trusted her. Maybe that was true. I don't know. People are capable of believing what is convenient for them, and I was no longer in a position to sort out which parts of my daughter were real and which parts had been borrowed from someone else. What I know is this. I still live in the house on Clover Street. My garden is coming back. I've planted tomatoes along the south fence, the way Maggie always wanted, and they are doing better than I expected for a first try. Joe Kowalski called me on a Saturday morning in October and asked if I wanted to go fishing. I said I hadn't been fishing in 20 years. He said that was obvious, and that he would teach me to be less useless about it. We drove out to a lake about 40 minutes from town that his brother-in-law owns a cabin on, and we sat in a small boat for 4 hours and caught almost nothing and talked about everything, the way men do when they have been through something together and come out the other side. Joe's wife, Barbara, started sending food with him when he knew he'd see me. Casseroles at first, then a whole Thanksgiving dinner in foil containers because she had heard I was spending the holiday alone, which I was. I ate that Thanksgiving dinner at my kitchen table, and I thought about Maggie, and I thought about Claire, and I thought about the cost of things you can't get back. Then I put the dishes in the sink, and I called Joe and said, "Tell Barbara this was the best sweet potato casserole I have ever had in my life." Barbara got on the phone and called me a liar and said Maggie's was better, and I said, "You're right," and we both laughed. And that was the first time I had laughed since the paper cup of terrible coffee in the hospital waiting room. There is a version of this story where I become bitter, where the thing Claire did made me smaller, more suspicious, more alone. I understand that version. I felt it pulling at me in the months after they left, the way cold water pulls when you're standing in a river. It would have been easy, but I spent 30 years running toward things other people ran away from, and I am not built for letting things pull me under. I see Joe almost every week now. I helped him repaint the back of the store in September. He helped me fix the fence along the south side of the yard, the one that had been leaning for 3 years, while I kept telling Maggie I'd get to it. We got to it. The tomatoes are doing well. There is a man who comes into Kowalski's every Tuesday morning named Franklin, who is 71 and retired from the railroad, and who lost his wife the same year I lost Maggie. Joe introduced us in November, deliberately, the way a man introduces two people he has decided should know each other. Franklin and I have coffee now on Tuesday mornings. He is quieter than Joe. He is a good listener. He told me once that the worst thing about losing a spouse is not the grief, which is survivable, but the way it makes you doubt your own judgment about people, which is harder to come back from. I told him about Claire. He told me about his son. We sat with that for a while. I did not find a new family the way you find a new house, deliberately, by searching. I found it the way you find things when you stop expecting to. A man behind a register on Jefferson Street who knew how to stay quiet while you talked. A woman who sends casseroles because she cannot help herself. A railroad man who understands what grief does to your confidence in your own eyes. The house on Clover Street is mine. The mortgage has been paid off for 11 years. The garden Maggie always wanted is growing along the south fence. In the evening, when the light is good, I sit in the backyard and sometimes I talk to her, which I know is not a practical activity, but which I have decided to stop apologizing for. I tell her about the tomatoes. I tell her about Joe and Barbara. I tell her she was right about Derek, which I have told her approximately 40 times now. I do not tell her she was right about everything. A man has to keep some dignity. I am 63 years old, and I live alone on Clover Street in Roanoke, Virginia, and I am, to my own considerable surprise, mostly all right. Not the all right I would have chosen. Not the life I planned in that house with Maggie in the room that still smells like her perfume when I open the closet door. But all right in the way that matters. The way that means you got up and you chose something, even when someone you love tried to take the choice away from you. Some betrayals come from strangers. Those are clean in a certain way. You see them, you name them, you move on. The ones that come from inside your own house are different. They take longer. They change the shape of things. You learn to live with a slightly different version of yourself, one who knows things he didn't know before and cannot unknow them. But I am here. The fence is fixed. The tomatoes are growing, and Joe Kowalski is not a blood relative, and neither is Franklin from the railroad, and neither is Barbara, who makes sweet potato casserole that is almost as good as Maggie's, but not quite, and none of that makes them anything less than exactly what they are, which is the only family I have, and more than enough.